Welcome, viewers. This week we take a look into the lore of Drummond Hill Cememtery in Niagara Falls, Ontario, reputedly Canada's most haunted cemetery. But will the lore stand up to a little scrutiny? Can it handle the suplex of truth, the diamond cutter of honesty? Or will we be subjected to a tombstone piledriver of irrefutable evidence of the supernatural? Find out on this episode of I Fought the Lore, now occasionally on YouTube. Our tale begins over 200 years ago with a major battle between British Canada and the United States of America, the War of 1812. The War of 1812 actually stemmed from a conflict between France and England, which had been ongoing for 20 years or more. Now, during that conflict, in 1806, in an effort to cripple the British trade, Napoleon ordered all ports under his control to be closed to British ships. He then ordered that any neutral or French ships that entered a British port before entering a continental port would be seized. This caused the British to enact a rule that required all neutral ships to be issued a license before they could sail to Europe, and the British Navy enforced a blockade against France. And America was caught right in the middle. America was a neutral nation in the European conflict, and as tense as relations already were between America and Britain, they were made worse when British naval ships began stopping and searching American ships for contraband and deserters from the British Navy. Many deserters of the British Navy found work on American ships, but when they were discovered by the British naval searches, the deserters were taken into custody and forced back into service in the British Navy. Even British-born men who had gained American citizenship were seized in some cases, and British captains even tried to force American-born sailors into British service during these searches. None of this sat well with the American government or people. In 1807, a British naval ship demanded to search the American naval vessel, the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake captain knew he had British deserters on board and refused the order to be searched. The British then fired on the Chesapeake, crippling it, and killing 3 and injuring 18. Now, the British boarded and seized 4 men as deserters. This caused outrage in America. Keep in mind, during this time in history, word didn't travel very quickly, and while the British government had actually rescinded the orders which were causing such tension, the American government, at the same time, declared war against the British on June 18, 1812. Canada, being a British colony, was now the territory of the enemy, and the American government believed that Upper Canada, which is present-day Ontario, would be an easy target. It was lightly defended, and many of the people living there were already Americans. Because of this, the American government believed they would be welcomed by the population, who would then assist them in their fight against the British. But that didn't go quite as planned. And the rest is history. Although what preceded it was history too, I guess, so in the end, it's all history. Anyway, that history eventually led to one of the bloodiest battles of the War of 1812, which took place in Niagara Falls, partly on the land that would eventually become the Drummond Hill Cememtery. On July 25, 1814, about 1,000 American troops were marching from Chippewa along Portage Road to the intersection of Lundy's Lane. The British, under General Drummond, had also been advancing along Portage Road and had set up guns on the high ground of Lundy's Lane. When the Americans came to a halt within range of the cannons, the British opened fire, and that began the Battle of Lundy's Lane at about 7 p.m. Now, the day was described as hot, with very little wind to disperse the clouds of black powder and smoke from the cannons and rifles. The battle was fought at close range, and in the chaos and thick smoke, many of the wounded were as a result of friendly fire from both sides. The Americans pushed forward, taking the British guns several times, but eventually withdrew after midnight, and the British advanced again, taking control of the area while waiting for another attack. That attack never came, and in the morning light, the field was littered with the dead and dying from both sides. Now, Drummond Hill was named in honor of General Sir Gordon Drummond, who I just mentioned was leading the British and Canadian troops. He was a Canadian-born British Army officer and the first official to command the military and the civil government of Canada. It would have been easy to bury the dead where they lay and declare the area a graveyard, but the resulting casualties of war isn't why this place became a cemetery. Let's jump back a bit to 1799. Christopher Buckner purchased 400 acres of land from his father-in-law, James Forsyth, in 1799. Now, this was 13 years before the war, and part of that 400 acres included this area that we're here to talk about. Buckner designated half of an acre at the top of the hill as a burial ground. This would become what is now Drummond Hill Cemetery. The land was attached to the Presbyterian Church, also located on the hill, and the first interment was a man named John Birch in 1799. Birch had actually died and had originally been buried on his farm in 1797, but he was reinterred on Drummond Hill 2 years later. And after that first half acre was filled, Buckner donated another half acre to increase the cemetery's size. So, by the time the War of 1812 broke out, this plot of land was already a cemetery. It was fenced with wooden posts and shaded by large maples. Years passed and the war came and went, and eventually the cemetery, which actually does contain burials for British, Canadian, and American soldiers that died during the Battle of Lundy's Lane, came under the stewardship of the Niagara Parks Commission in 1910, and then was eventually transferred to the City of Niagara Falls, Ontario in 1996, the same year that they installed this historic marker at the entrance gate. Drummond Hill Cemetery is now a nationally recognized heritage site. It's, of course, most famously known as the battlegrounds of the Battle of Lundy's Lane, as well as the burial site of local hero Laura Secord. Laura Secord was a Canadian woman, recognized nationally as a civilian hero of the War of 1812. After American troops occupied her family's home in the town of Queenston in Upper Canada, she overheard the officers talking about plans to attack another area. Armed with this knowledge, Laura snuck out of the house and past American troops and guards and walked 20 miles so she could warn British forces of the impending American attack. Her effort was recognized as having had a major impact on the Battle of Beaver Dams and a major contributing factor in the British victory that day. Most people would probably recognize the name due to the Laura Secord Chocolates Company, but Laura didn't actually have anything to do with them. The company actually named itself after her on the centennial anniversary of her historic walk. But the Battle of Lundy's Lane and Laura Secord aren't the only interesting things about this specific cemetery. Let's take a look at the War of 1812 monument. This battle memorial was designed by the Canadian Parliament and unveiled by the Lundy's Lane Historical Society on July 25, 1895. This large cairn marks the remains of 22 British soldiers who were buried in the vault below it. 3 bronze plaques bearing the name of those killed in the Battle of Lundy's Lane were added to the monument in 1938. Drummond Hill Cemetery is also the burial place of other fascinating people, like Burr Lockhart Plato. Mr. Plato was born into slavery in 1833 in Logan County, in what is now West Virginia in the U.S. Plato and several friends fled from Logan County and used the Underground Railroad to reach Canada and freedom in 1856. He settled in Niagara Falls, where he learned to read and write and became an entrepreneur. He became popular and was a respected businessman, as well as an active member of the British Methodist Episcopal Church. He ran for councilman in 1886 in what was then the village of Niagara Falls, and although he did encounter racism here as well, and doubt about his abilities, he was supported not only by the African Canadian members of the community, but by his white neighbors as well. Mr. Plato became one of the first black people in Canada to be elected to a political office and held the position until he retired in 1901. Mr. Plato passed away in 1905 at the age of 72, having prospered in the area. Drummond Hill is also the final resting place of daredevil Karl Suchek. Karl was a Czech professional stuntman living in Hamilton, Ontario, and he was most well known for going over the falls in a self-designed barrel in 1984. His custom-made barrel was 9 feet long and 5 feet in diameter. It was bright red and bore the words, "Last of the Niagara Daredevils, 1984. And it's not whether you fail or triumph, it's that you keep your word and at least try." Now, after successfully going over the falls, Karl tragically died in 1985 as a result of a stunt gone wrong when he attempted a barrel drop from the top of the Houston Astrodome into a water tank below. Now, some of you may be saying, "Rico, a haunted graveyard? Isn't that a little cliche?" Well, it may seem pretty average now. There are lists of haunted graveyards all over the internet, but believe it or not, it used to be generally accepted by the paranormal community that graveyards were rarely haunted. People who were buried there didn't die in that location, and none of their possessions would be there to attach them to the place after death. So why would their spirit hang around? I mean, the argument makes sense, but some point in the last 30 years or so, there are more and more claims that cemeteries are regularly haunted. But regardless of why there was a change in the opinion on graveyards and hauntings, Drummond Hill is still considered to be the most haunted graveyard in Canada. But Rico, you handsome devil, who haunts this place? That's the question I hear you asking, or maybe yelling at your TV, tablet, computer screen, or phone. Rico, with your voice so silky it was practically made for radio and voiceover work. You just named off some famous, or at least locally famous people, but which of them aren't resting comfortably in the afterlife, and which one of them feels the need to return to this mortal world to walk these paths? Who haunts this hallowed ground you demand of me? Well, it's none of them, okay? So chill. Relax. We're getting there. Rico always gets there in the end. Sometimes you just have to take it slow. Get some context. Drummond Hill Cemetery isn't considered haunted by the mere fact that it's a cemetery. And it's not haunted by the locally famous people who've been interred there. The reason this place is haunted is because of its history as a battlefield and all of the death that resulted from that conflict. But Rico, I thought we were here to talk about ghosts and the supernatural, or maybe some kind of cryptid or something. You're probably now saying, why not get to the point, you jacked, buff goblin hunter? Well, okay. Cool your jets. Rico's got what you need, baby. Let's talk about who haunts this place. The ghosts of British redcoats who died during the War of 1812, protecting British Canada from an invading army. They are the ghosts that supposedly haunt this place. Now, it's been reported that shadow figures and transparent figures have been seen moving among the gravestones here. But more specifically, from the nflibrary.ca website, that's Niagara Falls Public Library, quote, "The ghosts of 5 soldiers dressed in Royal Scots uniform have been seen limping across the cemetery and disappearing in the distance. An apparition of 3 battle-weary British soldiers have also been seen moving up Drummond Hill towards the old Lundy House, which was used as a rest stop and a hospital during the war. The old Lundy House was once located where the Canada One Outlet Mall now sits on Lundy's Lane." The website HamiltonParanormal.com has some ghost photos and write-ups from a night investigation they did on October 5th, 2003, claiming the photos they posted contain ectomist, which, in their mind, suggests paranormal activity, if not an actual haunting. Now, I looked up the historical weather data for that date, and by 3 a.m., when the write-up claims they started their investigation, the temperature was between 0 and 3 degrees Celsius in the city, or 32 and 37 degrees Fahrenheit, at 3 a.m. That's definitely cold enough to see your breath in a photo due to being too close to the camera, or possibly cigarette smoke. The notes also said they heard running boots and the faint yelling of men in the distance in the cemetery. Now, the major problem with doing any sort of investigation during the day or night at this location is that it sits right alongside one of the busiest major streets in the city, and it's very near 2 other major streets as well. There are cars and people around at literally all hours of the day and night. A proper investigation is almost impossible because you'll catch vehicle and human noises constantly from the streets and sidewalks surrounding this place. And the cemetery isn't very large, so it's not a matter of moving to investigate in a more quiet area. There is no area that's any more quiet. The cemetery isn't locked either. The main gates are closed so vehicles can't enter, but there's always an open gate from the Drummond Road side and an open gate from the Lundy's Lane side for anyone to walk through at any time of the day or night. Lundy's Lane immediately on the north side, Drummond Road immediately on the west side, and Main Street less than half a block away to the east. All 3 are major roads with major intersections, and 2 of those roads contain restaurants and bars open late into the night. Now, that's not to say that ghosts don't haunt the place, just that doing any sort of investigation is going to be so full of outside noise and the environment is completely uncontrollable that it's practically not worth the effort. So really, all we have to go on is anecdotal evidence and personal experiences. Here's an encounter from an article on ghostwalks.com posted by Ghost Guide Daniel. The article states, during a visit by the Ghost Walks, while on a Niagara Ghost Bus tour, 3 guests witnessed them while exiting the cemetery. I'm assuming that refers to witnessing them means witnessing ghosts. The article goes on, walking through the front gates, a woman turned to look back. She had felt a cold breeze on her neck. She screamed to the others, "Turn around! Look!" They all saw black figures, like shadows hovering behind graves. The shadows hovered behind the headstones as if wanting their attention. A quick flash of darkness on the daytime grounds, and then they were gone. Returning to the bus, the others remained silent, waiting for the woman to share her story. Quote, "What did you feel at this moment?" I asked this to all 3 of them. No answer, but their faces said, fear. This next story is one I remember hearing on a Drummond Hill Cememtery ghost tour that I was part of in the early 2000s. This was back when they first started doing their tours. It was also told on a short-lived Canadian ghost hunting show called The Girly Ghost Hunters during their first season, episode 6 from 2005. Now, to access the cemetery from Drummond Road, you have to go down a short lane called Buckner Place. There are no more than 2 houses on each side of the road before you come to the parking lot for Drummond Hill Cemetery and the Presbyterian church that it's attached to. The last house on the right is an old home painted blue. A former resident tells the story of a temporary haunting that occurred in her house which lasted only a few weeks during the year 1995. Her story goes like this. At that time, 1995, there had been some vandalism in the cemetery. Many of the old gravestones had been kicked over and broken apart. Yep, classy people doing classy things. Ben and I have mentioned several instances of this on the I Fought the Lore podcast. Stull and the graveyard in Edmonton on our Canadian UFO episodes, just to name 2 of them. Now, a restoration project was announced and work began to repair the damage that had been done. During that time, the resident of the Blue House claims that her dog started acting strange. Her dog would sit by the fireplace, barking, whining, and crying. They couldn't get the dog to stop, and she wouldn't leave that room unless she was dragged out. This went on for a couple of weeks. Coincidentally, after the repair and restoration work was done in the cemetery, the dog calmed down. The fireplace was no longer a source of concern or fear for her, and she went back to being her normal doggy self. The resident of the house believes that the vandalism drove one or several spirits out of the cemetery, and I guess they took refuge in her home until things were put right in the burial ground and they could return to it. And while researching this place and trying to find people with personal stories to tell, it was suggested that I check out Season 2, Episode 10 of Creepy Canada, another Canadian show about ghostly tales from the Great White North. Creepy Canada ran from 2002 to 2006. In the episode, which aired on May 4th, 2004, the host recounts several stories of people having ghostly experiences in the graveyard. The first story takes place one afternoon. A young man decides to take a shortcut through the cemetery on his way home, and he's done this many times in the past. He's not a believer in ghost stories or in the rumored hauntings that he's heard about Drummond Hill Cememtery, but that day, as he walks through the cemetery, he sees three figures appear further down the path that he's on. They're dressed oddly and begin walking towards him, but then they just vanished. Being confused, he looks around and hurries on his way, not really sure what to make of the thing he just saw, when he suddenly feels as though he's being watched. He looks back over his shoulder and sees three figures suddenly behind him, and they're very much closer than they were when they appeared the first time. There are three British redcoats marching in pursuit and carrying long rifles. He begins to run, heart racing, towards the gate, looking back over his shoulder. The soldiers are still behind him in pursuit, no further away despite the fact that he's now running. He bolts for the gate and through the exit and doesn't risk looking back again to see where they were or if they were still chasing him. And the final story from that episode of Creepy Canada was of a waitress who was on her way home from work late one night. To save time, she decided to use the cemetery as a shortcut, which she had done many times in the past. This time was different, though. As she entered the graveyard, she felt that she wasn't alone and had the growing sensation that she was being watched. She stopped to look around, but saw no one, and so she continued on her way. But the feeling grew stronger. She began moving quicker and hurried along the path to the gate. Once she crossed that boundary and exited the cemetery, she began to feel a little easier. She took the opportunity to look back through the gates and into the cemetery, and for just an instant, she saw three redcoat soldiers walking in her direction, along the path she'd just been on, and in the next instant, they disappeared. According to the episode of Creepy Canada, the waitress never took that shortcut again. TV shows from the early 2000s are great and all, but how do you verify anything that they've said? For all we know, the producers read that the place was haunted by British soldiers and could very well have made up the rest to fill airtime. I wanted to find locals with personal experiences, so where better to look than Reddit, and maybe Facebook. After finding no existing threads, Ben and I posted requests for personal ghostly encounters in Drummond Hill Cememtery. We posted in the Niagara Falls, and St. Catharines subreddits, and on the Facebook pages for Niagara Falls History and Niagara Paranormal. Facebook resulted in a response from a user called Murray Mako. He said he and some friends decided to explore the room below the 1812 monument. The group only had one flashlight, and the stone stairs leading down to the open gates were slippery. Murray said that he and his friends didn't go into the chamber under the monument very far because they were all pretty scared, and they all turned and ran out pretty quickly after getting inside. Afterwards, Murray said that the crypt door was locked and a cage was put over the stairs, so not only was the crypt inaccessible, you couldn't even walk down the stairs to look through the bars. I can attest to that. This photo shows the cage that was placed over the stairs to prevent anybody from going down them. Now, I'm not sure when that happened, but the cage is gone now and the stairs have been filled in with dirt, preventing anybody from gaining access. I also have a similar personal story to tell. As a little Rico, I played in this cemetery many times as well. I have family buried here, and I was no stranger to the place. Back then, in the 80s, it was a nice, quiet place. My grade school was right next door. It's now a retirement home. And so I saw the cemetery pretty much every day. My best friend through much of grade school also lived just a street over to the north, and we would come here to hang out. I had always been curious what was under the War of 1812 monument. I didn't know if it was a crypt. I thought maybe there were a bunch of soldiers buried under there, or maybe it was a general. But I really had no idea, and it was intriguing to me. After all, it was in a graveyard. There were stone steps leading down into the ground from it, and there was a barred gate at the bottom with a lock on it. You could see through the bars a little if you went down the 10 or 15 stairs, but there was no light, so you couldn't really see much. But I was so curious. One day, my friend and I were hanging out in Drummond Hill, and the caretaker walked by. So we asked, "Hey, what's down there?" The guy pulled out a key ring from his pocket, went down the stairs, and unlocked the gate for us. So we went in. I don't remember that much all these years later, except that it was a big stone room. I think there were maybe stone bench-looking things along two of the walls, and that was pretty much it. Maybe they were just part of the structure, or maybe they were stone coffins. I had no idea. I'd been so excited, but there really wasn't all that much to see. And I remember feeling kind of let down. I'm not sure what I actually expected, though. I mean, ghosts, goblins, a spooky skeleton, perhaps. Anyway, my friend and I said thanks and we left. The other thing I do remember about it was how pissed off my mom was. And in retrospect, I understand why. I was a little kid who asked a stranger to let me into a locked room, and the only other person was there was another little kid who also wanted to be let into that locked room. I mean, that guy could have done anything to us. Good thing there weren't any white vans offering to show me puppies or something. Anyway, that's all I remember about it. Now, like I mentioned earlier, it turns out that it is a crypt, and the remains of 22 British soldiers are buried in the chamber below that I was in, which I guess is pretty cool. In all of the years I've visited this place, I've never had any spooky experiences here, and I've never felt scared. Myself and the friend I just mentioned even made our own Ouija board and used it in this place. The only thing that happened was that I called him out for pushing the homemade planchette. The only other personal experience that I received through social media was from Reddit. User UFOSWW was kind enough to provide an experience for me to share. Quote, "A few years ago on Halloween, my sister from out of town and my daughter and I went out to the Drummond Hill Cememtery to look for some ghosts. We also went to the Screaming Tunnels, and the last stop was the Chippewa battlefield. When we do ghost hunting, we bring out our night vision equipment, ghost boxes, EVP equipment, and EMF detectors. My daughter's over by the church looking at some headstones with me, and we're talking about how old they are and about the history behind the hill, and then my daughter says, 'Something just touched me.' And on the EVP immediately afterwards, it says, 'I did.'" Pretty cool story. When researching this episode, I kept coming across the claim that Drummond Hill Cemetery is the most haunted cemetery in Canada. Even on the day I came to film, there was a couple walking through the place as a shortcut, coincidentally enough, who said those exact words to me. And it's great that this is a legend that's known so widely, but I'm just not so sure myself. Quote, "It's haunted by redcoats," is really the basics, and there are no more than a handful of personal stories that I could track down, and a couple of those which I'm not sure weren't made up to sound good on TV. Again, I've been here during the day in every season. I've even been here more than once in the dead of night trying to have an experience myself, but nothing. And I'm aware that just because I haven't seen a ghost here, that isn't proof that there aren't any. I just think I need more convincing. This is Rico Sweets from the Mean Streets, signing off for this episode of I Fought the Lore from Drummond Hill Cemetery.